All right, welcome to a special Gateway API meeting on May 21st, at least in California. We've got a few things to run through today, but this is very focused on Gateway API versioning and the problems we've been having and some potential solutions to that. Flynn has written up an excellent doc to provide some background. So with that, I'll hand it off to him.
Well, we probably should mention, just for the sake of it, I'm confident it won't be a problem. But for this very special Gateway API episode, we should remember that this is a normal Kubernetes meeting code of conduct applies, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, fair point.
So we still have to be nice to each other. All right, fine.
Yeah,
I'll trash all the non-compliant jokes I was planning on making. I'm completely joking. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh man. Okay, so what I was saying was that this document, and many thanks to people who have been commenting on that one. This document was less about proposing a solution and more about trying to capture the state of play. The really short version of this one is that if you dive far enough down the rabbit hole and look at what the API server does and what it does not do, you will find that the field called API version is mostly a lie. It is not talking about the version of a resource that has been stored. It is talking about the version of the API that you used during a particular transaction, which has nothing to do with the version that was stored.
I think it's tangentially related in that they need to be like field convertible.
The problem is that the API server does not remember what version was stored. And so since nothing in the API storage, since nothing in the resource storage can tell you the version that was written, this basically yanks the rug out from under you on most of the things you would like to do to enable some sort of seamless conversion. This makes our life challenging because if we don't know what version a thing is, then trying to figure out anything about comparison is hard. If we cannot figure out things about comparison, that makes it very, very difficult to know a priori things like, oh, am I using any things that are experimental versus standard? Is it safe for me to move from experimental to standard? Ultimately, Gateway API needs an experimental channel where we can change things, but we also need a way to move between experimental and standard, because presumably people who are using the experimental channel are doing it because they want to help develop some feature. And then most of these people, once the thing they're interested in becomes standard, they are probably going to want to leave the experimental channel behind. I don't know that I want to go through and read this. Well, okay, I know I don't want to go through and read the whole document with dilated eyes. I also am not sure it would be terribly useful to read it. So if people have questions about the admittedly somewhat wildly counterintuitive things that I just said, then that might be a productive way to do it. Or perhaps it would be productive to skip ahead and start looking at some possible options. I think Nick and Rob are the ones who have voiced the loudest opinions here. So I don't know. What do y'all think in terms of the directions we'd like to go here for this meeting, if not for solving the problem at hand? Uh-oh, Keith is raising his hand. He's got some off-color joke. What do you want, Keith?
I think it might actually be good to start with the preserve unknown fields discussion. So I think that
Okay.
that's a useful, maybe a gentle introduction into solving some of these problems. I know I looked into this for as part of potentially building some sort of release channel thing into Istio, and this is kind of where things kicked off. So maybe discussing this briefly might help us shift into some of the problem solving side of it. What do you think?
I'm happy to talk about preserve unknown fields. Kubernetes preserve unknown fields is the marker that you can place in a CRD. And I should probably also point out, I am going to deliberately use CRD and CR in their literal senses, not in the mostly equivalent way that we often use them. If you put X Kubernetes preserve unknown fields into a CRD, and I'm not going to lie, I cannot remember right this second if you could just set that per version or only per resource, and it doesn't matter, then you are telling the API server, you know what? Let me back up again. One thing that the API server can do with the API version field is it can use the API version field to effectively look up a defined schema. And normally, if you are fetching a resource with a particular API version, the API server will look up the schema for that version and then only hand back the fields that are defined by that schema and that version. If you set X Kubernetes preserve unknown fields, it will ignore everything I just said. It will find all of the fields it can find for your resource, and it will hand you all of them.
Yes.
On the face of it, this seems like it's a nice, neat, clean way that you can just set that field and you can go and get everything back, and then you can use what is set to intuit which version a thing was stored under, and then you can do conversion in your application. The astute reader will note that I personally have said such things in the past before thinking harder about it. Actually, man, I might not have said that in public. I might have only said that to Rob, and now I look stupider than I otherwise would. But there are some really nasty problems with this.
Yes.
In no particular order.
Well, before you go, there's actually one even more interesting thing about this, and that is the API version also matters when the record gets written to Kubernetes.
Yes.
Because the API server, when you put something, will take the schema of the record at the API version it believes it is, and convert it to the storage API version, right? Which may involve just throwing away fields.
If we don't have conversion webhooks in play, I think it only gets to involve throwing away fields, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So it will ensure that the thing you are writing into etcd fits into the storage version shaped hole. And all of the fields that are saved into etcd will only have the fields that are defined in the storage version's schema. If you turn on preserve unknown fields, that will not be the case. So when you pass, if you send v1 and the storage version is v1 alpha 2, and you added more fields in v1, then those fields will stay when you do preserve unknown fields.
Right.
More importantly for our discussion, if you are running v1 experimental and that has extra fields, and you take them, and you've got preserve unknown fields on, and you send them, and you've got extra fields, and the API server has the standard definitions, it'll be like, okay, no problems. I'll take those extra fields and I'll just save them down to etcd. And so that then becomes important later for what happens when you read them. So sorry,
right.
Then you continue.
Yes, very much worth pointing out. Preserve unknown fields works in both directions.
Yes.
So on the one hand, this causes some really fascinating things where if you are trying to use a typed client, by which I mean you have asked, you're basically using, I'm going to pick on client Go for a minute just because I think most people are familiar with it. You're using client Go and you tell it you want it to go and watch for v1 of the HTTP route resource, then even if those unknown fields come back, the deserialization in the client will throw them away anyway. So if you want to actually get any advantage of this, you have to use the unstructured client.
Yes.
And while you could conceivably write a layer over the unstructured client that would read the thing back unstructured, figure out what it is, convert it to something strongly typed so you can use it in the rest of your program, on the one hand, you're going to end up doing that every single time you get a resource from the API server, which kind of bites. And there's an even more fascinating and subtle thing where, let's say you want to watch for v1 alpha 1 resources and v1 resources at the same time. Remember, the API server does not know which version is stored. So what that turns into, if you're using the unstructured client, is that if you try to watch for two separate versions, you're going to get duplicates of everything, which you will then have to manage in your application, which is disgusting. One other thing which Nick points out in here, which is
So this one is if
yeah,
you save information into a field with preserve unknown fields on, or you post something that has a field that's the experimental one, you've got the stable ones there. That'll actually get saved, even though when you get it back, it won't be visible. That will then be saved in. If at some point later the cluster switches to using the experimental ones, when you read the record back, you will get the values for the experimental fields.
right.
And even better, if those experimental fields had changes made, so say they were enums, and the value that you posted before was an invalid value in the enum, when you read it out, you will get an invalid value for the enum, which maybe your code handles and maybe it doesn't. And so like this is one of the many reasons why it is strongly recommended to never turn this thing on. Like if you go and read the CRD design things, it's like I think actually for some, I think in custom resource definition V1, it's actually very difficult to turn on preserve unknown fields because it actually disables some features of CRDs when you turn on preserve unknown fields because of this all this shenanigans.
One of the really interesting, I have had a lot of discussions on this topic with a lot of people recently. One of the most fascinating things is the number of times I've had this discussion with people who've been using Kubernetes for a while and had them go, wait, really? Which is frightening, honestly. But yeah, one of the really interesting ones kind of had to do with some of this stuff where I was talking to the guy who had done a lot of work with conversion webhooks back with Emissary, and he had many strong opinions about CRDs and preserve unknown fields and things like that. And those strong opinions ended up being part of the reason why he does not work with Kubernetes anymore, which is grim and bad and a great loss to humanity,
Yeah.
or at least to Kubernetes. Um,
That would definitely do it.
yeah,
This whole
but
versioning thing scares me.
it's
And this is
really
why there are two documents that in total are somewhere in the region of 30,000 words in length about how to correctly design Kubernetes APIs and how to safely do API changes.
yeah, it's a very disturbing rabbit hole to go down. I think that covers everything on my mind for preserve unknown fields.
Yeah.
I guess we may as well really briefly, or sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I think we're headed in the same direction, but I think we're agreeing on the problem statements now, and I think it's useful to transition into how potential solutions that could exist for us going forward, which you've proposed a couple here.
I was also going to say, I think it might be worth very quickly disposing of conversion webhooks as well, which I think we can do simply by saying that even just from the operational point of view, they introduce a lot of pain. If anybody wants to know how much pain, they can come talk to any of us at Emissary who actually use these. They're also really interesting because one specific case I'd like to call out here is that conversion webhooks give the impression that conversion webhooks give the impression that the API server does know what version is stored so that it can convert. And that is also a lie. The API server knows what version the CRD marks as the stored version, and it knows how to look to see if the API version used for a request is the same as the stored version. But as mentioned in the doc, if you store a resource at v1 alpha 1, and then you change the storage version to v1, and then you do a fetch at v1, even though you wrote that CRD, sorry, even though you wrote the original CR at v1 alpha 1, the webhook won't get called because at this point, the storage version and the requested version line up. So yeah, the same guy I was talking to pointed out that if you really want to use webhooks correctly, the most correct way to do the webhook would be to make sure you have the conversion webhook in place even from the very first version of the CRD, and then have it wrap the resource in a larger structure that explicitly saves the stored version so that you can then make some real decisions anyway. And that sounds just terrible. Probably correct, but terrible.
I guess
Yeah, anything
one
else?
thing
Go ahead.
before we move on to talking about solutions and problem solving a bit here, I think the other thing that's really important to remember is that we actually have two versioning problems, right? Like we have the
At least.
well, but the two big versioning problems that we have are how do you move from experimental to stable for new objects, for net new
Right.
objects that are moving from an alpha version to a stable version, and
Like gRPC route.
exactly. And how do you safely move a field that is present in the experimental YAMLs to stable in the stable YAMLs and have everything keep working safely? That one I think is much easier, that is largely complete. It's not 100% safe, but it's way closer to safe than the other one is. So I think that's what I tried to call out a bit in the discussion, in the PR discussion.
The antecedent for that one, whole objects is a lot simpler than fields, right? Is that what you were saying?
No. Fields is actually simpler. And that's the reason for that. The reason for that is that the typed clients that we provide and the structs that the CID definitions are built out of have the there's no experimental in those types.
Right.
Like,
Gotcha.
When you're using, if you're using V1 like V1 of Gateway, then you get all the fields, the experimental ones as well, right? And because we are very careful about additive changes for stable objects, that's okay. We have, to this point, we haven't had to revert an experimental change such that people will actually need to change their code, right? Like we haven't needed to remove or rename a field in the Go structs because we've never needed to do that.
We actually
But
have
we
done
haven't-
that with backend TLS policy, right?
Yeah.
So
No.
no, that is different because that is an API rev, right? Like, and so it's actually a different API, right? I'm talking about in V1 Gateway, right? Like,
Okay.
or V1 object that has an extra field in experimental. That's the one that I'm talking about. Like when we've got an extra field, like V1 Alpha 3 backend TLS policy is a different object to V1 Alpha 2. It has a different schema. Like it has a substantially different schema and a different API version. The other case that we have is where we're not revving the API version, but we are moving things from experimental to stable.
I would just make one tiny clarification. I think from the perspective of controller authors, it is both safe and simple to go from experimental to standard. But from the perspective of users where that upgrade may have happened accidentally, it can be very disruptive. But you just
So again, that's what I want to do is just have us talk for a little bit about experimental to standard in stable objects,
Right.
as opposed to experimental to standard in moving from moving around in experimental or moving objects from experimental to standard is different to like fields moving from present in some YAMLs to present in all YAMLs, which is what happens when we transition a field from experimental to stable in a stable object. Yeah. I know I had to say experimental and stable a lot of times in that sentence, and that's why this was hard to explain. But an example here is timeouts, right? Like timeouts are still experimental, right? Like those fields are present in the HTTP route Go structs, no matter what version of the YAMLs you install, right? So if you are building your thing in Go and building against those those types, then the timeouts fields are there and you can write code to do something with them. And if that code runs in a cluster that uses the standard CIDs, then as an implementer, you don't need to do anything. You don't care because that code will never be exercised because the field will never be populated. And the change thing that we do is that empty fields add no behavior. So, if the field is empty, nothing happens, right? And so that's why field is empty, nothing happens is really important so that you can do that. The reason I want to mention that is that if we did the group thing, that is no longer the case. Because you're going to have because when you move a field from experimental, because it's a different group, a different object, a different Go struct, right? Like when we graduate things to standard, we're going to have different Go structs, right? Because they're different things.
I think one of my goals here would be to focus on what end users, customers, whatever experience, and assume that we can solve the problem from a controller layer, from a Go client layer, from a whatever. Let's just say that we can solve this, and from a control, I'm not even necessarily arguing for versioning the group, but yeah, I think right now I agree with you in the current state of controllers, you'd end up with different types, different packages. It would be a real pain. But if we can if we can move from that and just focus on like, what does this feel like for users, then we can maybe work backwards and see if we can make a solution that works for users and then make it work somehow on our side.
So
I was also going to point out for the record that the things that I wrote in here are not necessarily in a particular order. They're things that I put in here because they were in the notes. And I expect that this is not an exhaustive list, right? But yeah, just to be clear on that bit. I like Rob's idea of focus on what the users and then let's...
Yeah, I think
we might want to talk a little bit about it. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I was about to say, I see Keith's hand and I want to let him have a turn. But the thing that I wanted to say was that we need to keep in mind that I agree that what I just said is a solvable problem, but it remains to be seen how much engineering effort that is. If that is like multiple months for every implementation of engineering effort, it's probably not viable, right? Like that, but if it's multiple months of a shared engineering effort, it might be viable, but like there's going to be a resource discussion there about how much effort it takes and what we've got to put into it. I just want to call that out now. Okay. Sorry, Keith. Put your hand up.
That's pretty much exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Over to Keith.
Yes.
Who is muted? Who might be having internet problems.
All right, well, come back.
Maybe Keith is so disgusted by the idea of multiple months of engineering effort anywhere that he just rage quit.
Yeah, and so I think that maybe Keith interrupt me whenever, please. But what I was gonna say is the reason I'm trying to differentiate these problems into like problems that can be solved with better controller code, client code, whatever, and problems that can be solved by changing user behaviors. I'd rather just make the user experience better and then assume somehow we can solve the client side problem, and maybe that comes from someone at Google. I'm not saying me, but like maybe somebody. So that's just imagine that you have resources available magically out of nowhere that can help solve this problem. I can't commit to that, but let's just imagine that for sure. And then
so your caveat about I can't commit to that means that the discussion of how much effort it is still relevant.
It is relevant, but I guess what I'm trying to say.
I like the idea. I think we should proceed in that direction, and I definitely think we should have the discussion about how much effort it's going to be.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Keith, are you back after your Zoom segfault?
Yes, Zoom updated in the middle of the call and caused some. Speaking of
That's awesome.
end user experience. Anyway, I think what I was going to say has already been said by Nick and Flynn mostly. I do think, at Azure, I'm involved with multiple gateway implementations, and so um, again, I'm a big advocate for user experience. I do think that there becomes some upper bound where disparate engineering effort becomes untenable, because we are a large ecosystem in Gateway API, and we need to keep that large ecosystem. I think we have to be very conscious of engineering effort.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we shouldn't. My caveats have been well read into sort of the meeting recording. So, like, I'm happy to move on to like, let's actually talk about, like, Rob, your proposal. And like, let's talk about that. I think talk about Rob's one first, because I think the ones that you're currently showing on screen, Rob, rely on most changes being additive, do nothing essentially. And I agree that do nothing is not really sustainable. Like, we got to change something here.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Let me go ahead and present. This is not even much, but this is something that I had for another internal thing where I was trying to get some feedback on these ideas. And first off, provided, hey, this is what Gateway is. We all know that, so nothing new there. But I do want to remind everyone that CRDs actually have done a lot of good things for us, because, one of the things that we have to consider is, why are we even using CRDs? Because CRDs include pain. And we don't have feature gates, and we miss some things. But a reminder that we've got an independent release cycle. We can iterate quickly, theoretically. We can, every time we release, we can roll out those CRDs out to almost any Kubernetes cluster that exists. We support the most recent 5 minor versions. And there's no need for special development clusters. I think this is a huge one. If you're iterating on Gateway API, you don't have to wait for Kubernetes 131 to be, released before you can, test it with your controller. You can test whenever you want with whatever CRD is on main, and it should work. And then cell validation has been a huge win to improve a lot of UX and remove our validating webhook. I would say that multi-tenant CRDs have been a huge pain. We're all familiar with those. And then release channels have been a mostly successful thing, but they have their problems. Experimental channel has allowed for rapid development, allows us to make backwards compatible changes. And standard channel, in its lifetime of 3 years plus, has always had thorough conformance tests, has always been fully backwards compatible, and has never had any deprecation. So hurrah, yay team. And hopefully that can continue. So anyone staying on standard channel has had a very, very smooth experience working with Gateway API. That is one of the core goals I want to keep through all of this. If you stay on standard channel, you shouldn't have to deal with any mess. I don't want to add complexity to experimental, to users on standard channel just so that experimental channel can be a little bit nicer, for example, right? Because we want to optimize for the case where 90% of users are on standard channel, in my opinion.
Is that actually true right now, that 90% of the users are on standard channel?
No, I mean, I could say
I think 90% of the users in GKE are on standard channel, right, Rob?
Yeah. I don't think I can comment on specifics, but 100% of users of our controller are so it on GKE.
That was the point I was trying to make, is that you mandate standard channel for your controller. Yes.
Yeah. But to be clear, there is very strong interest for us to have a way where we can support experimental channel.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, yes. I mean, this is broad interest from yes.
Yeah. That was something that's in that summary doc that we didn't talk about, was some of that. But I think you're probably getting into that of this. Carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. So This is my classic example of when it all falls apart. Let's say Joe installs Gateway 1.1 standard channel. Sue wants to use, we don't have an experimental authorization feature, but let's just imagine she does, and it's an
We will have
experimental
that soon
HTTP
enough,
route.
so.
So yes, we will. And so she really wants to use it. And then Joe, he sees, oh, Gateway 1.2 just got released. Let me go ahead and update to standard to Gateway 1.2 standard because that's what I installed last time. And what do you know, that experimental authorization feature that Sue was relying on disappears. No errors, no anything. It's just gone. And a week or two later, she notices, wait, why is all the traffic getting through to my app? And there's no anything, right? And this is something that I think is both, entirely possible and awful UX, right? Everyone in this scenario did a reasonable thing, what seems reasonable. They just didn't happen to be talking to each other and didn't know they needed to, and it blew up pretty badly. This is the scenario I'm trying to avoid. Some more problems that are related here is that experimental CRDs just can't coexist with standard CRDs and more cluster providers. Right now it's just GKE, but I know others are on the way. We'll be installing standard channel CRDs, which effectively block usage of experimental channel, which is not a good place for our ecosystem to be in. I know GKE really wants to enable usage of experimental channel, but we can't install, alpha non-stable APIs on behalf of our customers. So if they want us to manage CRDs, we need to only manage stable ones and allow them to install on their own experimental ones, but we can't do that today.
That was a
I mean,
question
we
I've gotten
can,
a
but
lot
we
as a-
can't. Go ahead.
That was a question that I got a lot talking to people about this one was, oh, well, even if GKE installs the standard channel, couldn't you just go as a user of that cluster and go and dump the experimental CRD on top of it and have it take precedence? And my usual answer to that has been, I don't think the cluster provider sets things up so that RBAC will allow you to do that. But
yeah, so technically it's a different kind of limitation, but I expect it's going to be the same thing where if you're offering a managed CRD solution, one of the things you don't want to happen is, a future upgrade. So let's say GK is upgrading to v1.1 or v1.2 on behalf of customers. You don't want that to break them. So instead, we're just saying this is the version that we're managing. We know the upgrade from 1.1 standard to 1.2 standard is safe, so we'll do that for you. But if we allow, 1.1 experimental to be installed on top of 1.1 standard, and then we upgrade them to 1.2, then we've created this problem for them.
Practically though, like, I don't know, like, if you can't say, that's fine. But I wouldn't, if I was a cloud provider and I was writing a managed product that required the standard version, I would have a reconciling controller that watched the CRD, and if someone changed it away from the standard version, I would put it back. And say, sorry, and be like, you apply the experimental one all you like. You've got the standard one immediately. As soon as the reconciliation controller sees it happen, then it'll be like, no, sorry, this gets backed out immediately.
Yeah, that's basically how it works. Yeah.
That's how I would build it too.
Telling the people I was talking to, using RBAC in the discussion with the people I was talking to was a simpler way of addressing the same concern that basically boils down to, no, if your cluster provider is managing it, they are going to manage it and you are not going to be allowed to touch it. So yeah.
And this is, right now this is a problem that, as far as I know, is limited to GKE, but I have on good knowledge that this will be, more than GKE at the future. I know, obviously, Keith, you can speak to whatever Azure might or might not be doing, but I think this may also start to leak into, cluster provisioning tools as well, which have similar but maybe different concerns.
Yeah, and it intersects very strongly with the how do we recommend that people install install the CRDs? Does your implementation install them, or do you have to do it beforehand as a manual step or whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my first question I want to ask is, how much of this is an installation concern versus something inherent with the delivery mechanism with multi-tenant CRDs? So I think the problems on this current slide, on slide 7, these are inherent to multi-tenant CRD problem. I think the previous slide, like where things fall apart in this flow, I almost wonder if the problem here isn't confined to multi-tenant CRDs, and if maybe this is a installation experience problem. So again, I don't know about GKE, but I can say some of the conversations we've had within Azure is, how are we going to manage it to such a point where you can only move to one version that's supported to another version that is also, or sorry, making sure the upgrade process is safe. And to gate that installation process to where it's reconciled, there's only one door to go through. If you go through that door, it's guaranteed to be safe. I like right now, when a person wants to install Gateway API CRDs, they just run kubectl, apply, and point to GitHub. And if they've got RBAC permissions, it's there. Now we can't necessarily stop that from happening. But it does feel to me like an odd way to recommend people to install CRDs. I almost wonder if a different installation flow, maybe something with like Gateway CTL that installs this but runs checks first, prevents or at least dissuades this scenario from being run into. Because I agree with Rob, this is a disaster scenario here. But I wonder if solving it could be done separately from solving the other multi-tenant CRD nice to haves, if that makes sense. I don't know, maybe I'm completely wrong here, but it's a thought that I had.
I think you run into this even, wow. I don't think this is limited to the managed offering thing is the problem, where whether or not you've got somebody like GKE trying to manage the CRD is the thing on slide 6 is a real concern, right? Even if Joe and Sue are developers who happen to be sharing the same cluster and there's no, it's all bare metal stuff that they provision, GKE is nowhere around.
If they're running in Cilium or they're running in, Emissary or anything, right? Like it's still a problem, right? Like, because, and this comes back to the fact that this is a design, like a thing of a factor of the design that CRDs are singletons per cluster, right? Like a specific group and API version and kind. It's actually group and API version and resource, but anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. Group, API version and kind, like you can only have one, right? Like if you want to have another CRD that matches the group and the kind, you can have multiple API versions, but they've all got to be in that one schema. Like you can't have multiple ones that match the same thing. That's where, the proposal that Rob made in the PR is coming from, is like, well, let's add another group, right? Like, and make the different resources clear by adding the X onto the actual resource names. I think it's probably worth, I think we're already at 40 minutes and we haven't even got to any of the proposals yet. So I think we should probably move along. Let's talk about like the real proposal here is the one that Rob made originally that started off this whole thing. So let's talk about that. I think that the way that I would summarize this is the option is, do you have the summary of this option on slide there? Yeah. Separating the experimental and standard channel CRDs, which is a reasonable, like, it solves the problem of silent breakage by creating a migration problem. Like in this thing, what we are aiming to do is we are aiming to make migrating from experimental to standard require human action. tool maybe, but like require
Yeah.
like non-API server, or like, it's not going to be completely automatic. You're going to have to write a tool or have a person or do something, right? Like, that what we are doing here is preventing silent terrifying things happening by slightly annoying everybody and making them do non-silent changes to move between experimental and standard.
There's
Right, so
there's another way of looking at that also, which is that we're taking advantage of the thing that we actually control and can count on to provide some capability of putting in tooling to make this easier on the user. Which I think is important to call out, especially given Rob's mythical, magical engineering resource potential. Did I have enough
Yeah.
qualifiers on that? Um, I want to be clear here that I agree with what Nick is saying, that if we just change the group name and we don't do anything else, then we are 100% creating a thing where humans must be involved. And every time we change that group, then people have to do work. I also think it's important to call out that this may be something where we can provide tooling that makes it better. And
I mean,
we may also be able to be careful about, like, we don't necessarily need to change the group name when we're doing non-breaking changes and things like that. So I think that a lot of the pain here really is limited to the move from experimental to stable. And that's
so
probably worth bearing in mind.
yeah, this is where it comes back again to the to the distinction between field changes on stable objects and stable and experimental objects to stable objects, because this is a real problem for the object transition, less so for the field transition, right? Like,
Yes.
like it's still annoying, it's still a problem, but it's not nearly as big a problem. The Arco says in the chat that it makes it as, and Rob summarized as well, it makes it more painful to migrate from experimental to standard, but to stable to standard, but it removes the possibility of silent breakage in that process.
Yes.
So like that, and so and then the only ways that we would need the Michael asks, is it possible to guarantee safe within experimental channel? No, absolutely not, never, because we don't make guarantees within the experimental channel. We can't guarantee. We can say probably it'll be fine, but we can't guarantee, because you never know when there's going to be a breaking change that may be backwards that may not be compatible moving between experimental versions.
One of the proposals out there is also to make the guarantee that whenever we do a breaking change, we change the alpha version number, right? And that
so, I mean,
starts
we've always done
to
that.
come back into things like that, right?
Yeah, we've always said that that's what we would and do, right? Like,
Right.
so the version, but that that even doing that actually has a bunch of other version management problems, like the one that we had in backend TLS policy, where if you stop serving the old version because you've made a breaking change to the schema, now the object, you can't actually upgrade the thing until you delete all of the old objects from the cluster, right? So you need to delete the CRD, which deletes all the old objects, and that means that, guess what? Now you deleted all the config that you had in the cluster. I hope you had a backup.
Technically, you actually only have to remove the thing from the stored versions field of the CRD, right?
Yeah, but you won't be able to remove the config, then it'll still be stored in etcd and not accessible, right? Or, I mean, and if it's a different schema, it's gonna put you straight back into the preserve unknown fields shenanigans, right? Like, where you may have an invalid object stored in etcd because you've now got required fields in the new schema that were different to the required fields in the old schema. Also a bad idea, right? So, like,
I guess I was just trying to point out that it's even weirder than what you were talking about, in that, you would like to believe that you would have to delete all those CRDs, but in fact, or CRs, but in fact, you actually don't. You can get yourself into an even weirder scenario there, right?
So, I mean, practically, practically even this is not 100% going to solve everything, even for experimental to experimental upgrades.
Right.
Breaking changes are still going to require upgrade notes, like, which we added
100%.
post facto for 1.1. I think that going forward, we definitely need to make that a thing that if we have a breaking change, the release notes need to include upgrade notes that explain to you what the breaking change is and what you have to do about it. And so that people know this. I mean, that adds more cost to doing breaking changes, which is a good thing because we should not be doing breaking changes without a very good reason. So
I also want to call attention to something that Nick pointed out somewhere. I don't even remember where this was, but Nick, you made the point that the experimental channel is not currently the Wild Wild West, and we don't intend for it to become the Wild West. There's still a bunch of care that's being exercised by the API designers in the experimental channel too. I think that's important to bear in mind.
Rob.
Yeah, I think this. I think this back in TLS policy is the first breaking change in many years. Maybe
it's
ever.
V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2, yeah.
Yeah. And so I want to make sure that we can handle. Yeah, maybe this is all a shift in perspective, but what I really want to avoid is customers and users getting accidentally broken or unexpectedly broken. And if the cost is that, at least within experimental channel, upgrades become more painful, or going from experimental to standard becomes more painful but predictable, I would rather aim for that than things that can break badly and unexpectedly.
Rob, do you want to flip back to the other doc to take a look at a couple of other things that are in there?
I think if you want to scroll up again for I think I think there's one more thing that we need to talk about for versioning the group. And that is, I just want to run through, I've put a couple of things in there about it, but I just want to run through like a few of the changes that we know we would need to do if we did do this in terms of controllers and how you read these things. Right now, there is a very hard assumption in every major controller, like Go framework, at least. I don't know the other language frameworks very well, but in the Go framework as well, there is a very big assumption that one set of Go types equals one kind and group and API version, right? Like that is hard coded into controller runtime that one type has a version that you ask for, one Go type, and that's it.
And that's true in the Rust version as well, for example.
Right. Okay. So
although it's also true that Go and Rust both have support for type aliasing as well, right?
Yeah. So I mean, you can type alias and stuff like that, but the problem then is that you still have to cast between the types manually somehow, right? Like, and you have to cast between the types, you're going to have to recurse down into the type to find a struct that is shared between the two types. Now, it is possible to do some stuff and write your tooling such that when you are reconciling an object, the things that do the reconciliation, instead of taking whole objects, they take some like substruct that is the same between all the versions, right? So if you have gateway spec and gateway spec is the same Go struct between all the versions, then you can pass the spec around and wash away whatever version it came from. The problem is that if you're doing that, you're going to lose the metadata and annotations and labels and stuff as well, right? Like, and so practically what that means is that everybody is going to need to cast. These things mean that everybody is going to need to cast these things, the experimental and the standard versions with the different API groups, into some unified type, right? Like, like internally, somebody's going to have to do that. The controller runtime and the other stuff does not currently support that at all. And so that we would either need to have someone build that support into controller runtime. I don't know, but I suspect that might be tricky because reflection and a bunch of other fancy shenanigans. or we would need to write some helper stuff that would let you do that casting in Gateway API code, right? Like, and then that's gonna not be great for the Rust folks, because then you're gonna have to duplicate that code in Rust, right? Like, or or something.
There's a lot of stuff where the other option there is that I have seen a fair number of the controllers that I look at are already built with the idea that they're doing most of their internal computation using some sort of internal representation rather than the direct resource types, which is another way to look at that. Although obviously that might involve a lot of re-architecture for a lot of people, depending on how they wrote stuff in the first place, because it's different from what controller runtime does.
Yeah, I mean, for Cilium, like if we were to do it like that, we do have an internal representation, and we could 100% have a thing that watches for experimental HTTP routes and standard HTTP routes and turns them into the same internal representation, and the internal representation has all the experimental fields. 100% doable. That now means that your reconciliation code now is duplicated, essentially, right? Like, because it's all typed until it gets unmunged and put into the internal representation. All that I'm trying to do. Sorry.
Although I don't want to put words into John Howard's mouth, I think that he was saying something similar to that with work they'd done in Istio. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason I wanted to run through all of that is because that then sort of directly goes to how much will it cost, right? Like, in the sense that either we're going to have every implementation need to do something to handle it, or we build a library to handle it, or we change the frameworks to handle it, all of which are, like a not insignificant amount of engineering time.
I guess one other thing that we should probably point out is that it would also be possible to write your controller so that it supports either experimental or standard, but not both. Right.
Yes.
If we split the group name, then you have the ability to be very explicit about what your controller is going to work with.
You could release separate versions of the thing, but you're still going to have to manage 2 lots of source code to handle the different types.
Or you just decide we're only ever going to work with standard, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's what we don't want to happen, though, right? Because at that
we don't want.
For most cases, I think that's what we don't want to happen. There may be situations where it's appropriate. I'm not really trying to hold that up as a thing we want, just pointing out, right?
Yeah, we being Gateway API don't want that to happen, because that will mean that we don't get experimental feedback in a timely manner.
Right.
I think there's a balance, right? We have 25 plus implementations of Gateway API. I feel like realistically, we probably only need 5 or 10 or something that support experimental and give us that early feedback. It's not like we need 100% to support experimental.
True. Yeah, 100%. But like somebody's gonna have to do both, right? Like, is the thing. I mean, I keep harping on about all of this. That does not necessarily mean that I am 100% opposed. It's just like, like all I want to do is just make sure that if we're going to make this trade-off, we go into it eyes wide open with, this is how much it's going to cost all of us, and are we all clear that we're willing to pay that cost, right? Like, that's I think that doing this separate versioning thing is probably the least bad option, right? Like, all of the options are bad. Like, I want to be really clear here, like, to everybody in this room, every single option we have here sucks, right? Like, and we are choosing the least bad, the thing that is going to be the least bad for the most number of people, for the smallest amount of engineering time. We've got to optimize across like 4 or 5 dimensions here, right? Like, and that's why we are having all these discussions, is because we need to define the problem clearly enough that optimizing over those 4 or 5 dimensions is even possible.
I should also point out, I mean, Nick, you spend a lot of time kind of going through and saying, hey, I'm going to go through and be the guy who sounds like everything is awful and all that. But I really appreciate that. I think it's very useful.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think Rob, sorry, Rob, in your presentation, you mentioned there's another option or an additive option of different resource names, right? Prefix with X. What about not changing the groups, but sort of adding the new fields with the prefix X and somehow rejecting those when moving to standard stable?
So the fields themselves would have an X on the front of them?
It sounded like you'd leave the group the same, but you'd have an X HTTP route or an X gRPC route.
Yeah, which one did you mean, Arco? Resource names or field names?
Resource names.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's entire. It gets the same behavior. I think this will become effectively an implementation detail of which is harder to actually implement. If the API group change is more disruptive or resource name. But my guess is they're both going to be tightly coupled, and once you do one, the other doesn't add significant cost.
And also, it doesn't really solve the thing of as a cloud provider, I can freely allow people to install things that are not this specific group name. Doing the different API, like using a different API group, makes it much easier to write a controller that says, I'm going to watch all CRDs, and if I see anything with this CRD group, I check it, and if it's not my version, then I fix it, right? Like, being able to say, oh, there's a bunch of extra objects in that API group that I don't care about. I don't need to worry about those. That that makes that job of the coding that thing even harder as well. Like, not to say we shouldn't do it, but like then that's sort of pushing some complexity somewhere else. Maybe that's a good place to push the complexity though, to the
I think it is interesting that if it's all in the same API group, then you do land in this place where it's hard for a cloud provider to both manage the standard version and allow users to use the experimental version though.
Yes.
I don't think it's
How would you apply it as the user?
In that case, X becomes this kind of reserved term, and any resource starting with X, I just ignore it, right?
What it would mean is that the experimental YAMLs would not include the standard objects, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Right. So you would install the experimental YAML, and it'll install API group X HTTP route and API group X gateway, but not API group HTTP route. And then so they're completely disjoint. They're completely disjoint YAMLs.
Yeah. And your controller to make sure that everything is okay is just going to ignore the X ones.
I just realized we have gone past time and I have to drop for another thing. Real quick, it sounds like if the cost was low enough to controller authors, this would be an acceptable solution. But so it's worth at least figuring out if we can make the cost low enough. Is that a fair?
I think that would be a fair summary of where I'm at. Yes.
Okay.
That's also where I am. Yeah.
Yeah.
Matteo?
I think it's a nice idea. I mean, the engineering cost has to be not too high, and I think as soon as we provide some tooling or helpers or whatever that you already mentioned, I mean, the engineering cost can be cut pretty significantly, I think. But I mean, just letting everything on the implementation side and letting them just to deal with this kind of increased complexity is something that worries me a little bit.
It's okay. They're just controller authors. We don't have to worry about them.
I'm controller author, so I'm worried.
Yeah, me too. I think the other thing we need to ensure that is calculated in there, Rob, though, is tooling for users to help with the migration between the things.
Yes.
That's a very real thing. The first instance of this, if we make this change, will be painful for users too, and need to figure out how to do that if the cost can be low enough, it sounds acceptable, and I can try and figure out if we can make the cost low enough. But
Happy
okay,
to talk.
thank you.
Happy to talk about that too.
Cool.
I'd like to suggest, Rob, can you summarize all this in the? Actually, it kind of sounds like we might should fire up a GitHub discussion at this point.
Yeah,
rather than
that the
pitching it up
PR
PR.
has gone.
Yeah,
The
can
PR
you-
was
PR
a
has
proof of
served-
concept,
Has
but yeah,
outlived its
Yeah.
usefulness. Yes.
I
Yes.
agreed.
Yeah.
All right.
Can you
I gotta
summarize
run.
in a GitHub discussion?
Sure, I can do that.
Cool.
Okay.
Many thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Sorry to make you late.
Appreciate it, everyone.
Cheers.
Oh, well, the meeting didn't end when Rob left. How about that?
How
Okay.
strange. So, how have you
Let's,
been, Nick?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm going to hit stop on the recording though.
Yeah.